Hello, my name is Tim Shoebridge for Cherry Audio. I haven't done one of these videos in a very, very long time. In fact, I haven't done any videos in a very long time. But I can't think of a better reason to get back into that saddle than a Cherry Audio product release. So, without any further ado, let's take our first look at Atomica. So what is Atomica? Well, Mark Barton has teamed up with Cherry Audio again, and they have painstakingly reproduced what must be probably the most well-known and best loved of the synthesizers to come out of the former Soviet Union way back in the early 1980s. That synthesizer is called the Polyvox. Now, the Polyvox is so well known for having a very unique character to its sound. I think words like angry, raw, brutal and dirty, those kind of words spring to mind. The filter is unique. When you crank up the resonance, it screeches at you like no other filter does. The oscillators are unpredictable and unstable, and there's this general kind of overdriven, distorted signal path from oscillators all the way through to the output. It really is a characterful synthesizer, and I'm sure that must have given Mark and the guys at Cherry Audio an awful lot of challenges to try and reproduce that sound. Now let's take a look at the front panel and see what the architecture is like, but I just want to point out this is the first time I can put up my hand and say that here I'm doing a Cherry Audio product video, and I actually do own the synthesizer that it is modeled on. I've got, as you can see here, hopefully, probably it's a bit blurred, but I've got a Polyvox back here. This is actually my second Polyvox. The first one basically just disintegrated and fell apart. So this is my second one. So I do actually have some inside knowledge about what these synthesizers sound like. They are unpredictable, they are rather brutal and rather angry, unlike myself. Let's get back to Atomica and take a look at the front panel. So here is Atomica. It's looking wonderful, beautiful render, and look at that keyboard. It just looks so lifelike, like I could reach out and touch it. Before we actually go into the architecture and look at the components within the synthesizer, and it really is quite straightforward and simple, but before we do that, I just want to show you a few different things that you can do with the user interface, in case you don't know. First thing is, as wonderful as it looks, it does take up a lot of real estate on your screen if you've sort of like made it big enough to be able to go around and change things. So one thing you can do is a little button up here called Hide Keyboard. Obviously you don't need to see that keyboard. It looks beautiful, but you don't need to see it. So that's one thing to sort of like get back a bit of real estate of your monitor, of your screen, is to hide the keyboard. So that's the first thing you can do. Obviously you can resize this thing. I mean, I'm running it here not standalone, I'm running it inside my DAW, which is Cubase, and that's as small as it goes. So obviously I could have a whole load of these running at the same time, and it's very small like this and manageable. However, it's almost impossible to make changes to the controls like this. There is another little button at the top there called Focus, and when you click on it, it just zooms into the user interface. So now we're zoomed into the user interface. I can use the arrow keys on my keyboard, or I can use the sliders along the side and the bottom, and then I've got a much better sort of like more controlled way of making changes with my mouse to the controls than I would have if it was zoomed out and really, really small. That's the other thing you can do. And one more thing that I just want to point out. This is a recreation, a beautiful recreation of an original Soviet Union synthesizer. It wouldn't have had English labels on it at all. In fact, my first Polyvox that I bought had the original Cyrillic Russian wording on it. The one that I showed you at the beginning of this video, someone has gone over there and put little white labels over everything with English words, which is great, but it's not authentic. If you really want the authentic experience of using a Polyvox with the original wording, then what you can do is go to this little cog here, this little settings menu, go to interface, and then they've added here theme. It says English, but you can switch it to Cyrillic, and once you do that, you have you have the authentic experience of using a Polyvox. It's a great way to sort of like explore, right? Because unless you can speak Russian or maybe Ukrainian, you will have absolutely no idea what these things say. So it's about going in there, just grabbing knobs, grabbing controls, and just playing around with them and seeing what happens. But that is the authentic experience of a Polyvox. Right, so let's talk about the synth architecture of Atomica. Now, the original Polyvox synthesizer had a very simple architecture. It was a monophonic, subtractive, all analog synthesizer. It could actually play 2 notes at a time, so it was actually duophonic in nature. But it had a very simple architecture. It had 2 VCOs. It had a multi-mode filter of sorts, and we'll talk about that in a second. It had an amplifier section, of course. It had a couple of envelope generators and an LFO, and that was basically it. Now, with Atomica, what Cherry Audio have provided is a very authentic recreation of that original architecture, but they have decided to extend it, and I think they've done it in a very tasteful and sensible kind of way, in a way that is actually sort of backwardly compatible with the original circuitry that was inside the Polyvox. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about how Cherry Audio have extended the Polyvox architecture. We'll talk about that in a follow-up section. In this section, we'll just keep to the basics. We'll just talk about the things in Atomica that you will find in a Polyvox synthesizer. So here we have Atomica on the screen. I'm just going to click on this button top left, which is going to give me a new initialized patch. Now, an initialized patch with Atomica is actually us listening to both of the oscillators at the same time, so we get this lovely fat detune sound like this. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to turn down oscillator number 2 so that we don't hear it, we just hear oscillator 1 on its own. And I'm going to flick to the first waveform here, which is a triangle wave. So both of these oscillators are identical. They are an authentic recreation of Polyvox oscillators. We have got the basics of being able to choose the octave range of each of the oscillators. We've got a set of waveforms that we can choose. We have got the ability to modulate the frequency of each oscillator, and the modulation source is an LFO. We'll talk about that a little bit later on. Now, with oscillator number 1, we have a control here to be able to do cross-mod frequency modulation from oscillator number 2 to oscillator number 1. And with oscillator number 2, we have a detune control, so you can detune away from the oscillator number 1 frequency. So let's just listen to the waveforms very, very quickly. First of all, we've got the triangle wave. Very soft, subtle triangle wave. Next, we've got a sawtooth. Very, very nice, strong, buzzy sawtooth. We've got a square wave. It isn't quite as hollow sounding as a modern square wave would. It's quite a buzzy square wave. Now, we don't have pitch width. We don't have pulse width modulation with the Atomica or with the original Polivox, but we do have a couple of choices of a pulse wave here. So we've got this much. I can't remember how much it is. A thinner sound, and then finally this one. And that's it. That is what we have with both these oscillators. Now, as I had right at the beginning, if I blend them together, we can get really beautiful subtle detunes like this. We can go all the way up to 7 semitones, plus or minus, and obviously we've got cross mod, as I mentioned before. I hope you can hear there the aggressive sound, the aggressive nature of Atomica, which was the aggressive nature of Polivox 2. Right, so onto the filter section. This is obviously the heart of any subtractive synthesizer, and it was certainly the heart of the Polivox as well. There are quite a number of controls there. I think there's about 14, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14 controls. Now, Cherry Audio have added 4 controls to this section. So what I'm going to do with the magic of technology is I'm just going to temporarily hide the ones that Cherry Audio have added, and we'll just talk about the ones that are compatible with the original interface that the Polivox had. So there we go. Okay, so at the top we can see a dedicated filter envelope. It's a full ADSR envelope. Nothing particularly special about it at all. There it is. Here underneath we have the filter cutoff control and resonance control, which we would expect as well on any analog synthesizer's filter. Below it we have a response dial. Now, on the original Polivox, this was just a switch. As I mentioned earlier, it had a multi-mode filter of sorts. It actually had the choice of low-pass filter or band-pass filter. The low-pass filter is 12 dB per octave, and the band-pass filter is 6 dB per octave. So we've got those choices. Cherry Audio have given us additional choices. We'll talk about those later on. And then at the bottom here, we've got ability to modulate the filter cutoff. We've got this modulation control here, which is going to allow us to modulate the filter cutoff using the LFO, which is over here, by the way. It's called Modulator. It's an LFO over here. And as well as LFO modulation of the filter cutoff, we can also use the envelope generator, and we can apply positive or negative modulation of the filter envelope. So let's just have a little listen to the filter. So we've got it at the moment in low pass mode. So it's a 12 dB low pass filter. And of course, as we all know by now, it's the resonance, it's adding the resonance to an original Polivox filter that really does blow your socks off. And so let's just crank up some resonance and listen to the effect. Got that resonance effect, but it's really kind of driven and gnarly, isn't it? Let's crank it up even more. Let's go up to maximum. Then we get that screech. So let's have a go at modulating that with the filter envelope. So let's turn up this control here. So the keyboard plays the same way as it would on a Polyvox. It's in legato mode. So first note you hold down triggers the envelope. Subsequent notes you hold down won't. It's very, very snappy. Let's have a little listen to bandpass. Might be nice to modulate it using the LFO maybe. I don't know about the timing, 1982 when the Polyvox came out. Maybe it was the Soviet Union's answer to an Oberheim synthesizer. I'm not 100% sure of that. I don't know about the timing, but we've got this bandpass filter. It sounds really, really lovely. Right, so now let's talk about the amp section on the far right. There's not a lot to talk about there, so we'll also cover modulations. I know we kind of touched on modulations before, but we'll cover them in a bit more detail in this section. So let's look at that amp section, and like I did before, using the technology magic that we have available, let's just remove the controls that are not there on an original Polyvox. We will talk about them in the next section when we talk about all the wonderful things that Cherry Audio have added here, but for the time being let's just remove them. So there we go. We have literally just got an ADSR envelope generator, and then we've got the ability to modulate the amplitude of the output signal using the LFO. It's really that simple. There's really not a lot to it. However, I have glossed over completely two little white switches. They're labeled envelope mode, so let's talk about those now. So both the filter envelope and the amplitude envelope, they are just full ADSRs. However, the original Polyvox and now Atomica has got this capability to loop those envelopes. With modern envelope generators today, especially sort of digitally generated ones, we kind of take looping of envelopes for granted. Back then in 1982, with an analog only synthesizer, it was a little bit of a rarity, I think. So let's just have a little play around with one of these envelopes. Let's just choose the amplitude envelope, for example, and let's loop it and see what kind of things we can do with it. So I'm just going to play a single note. Now we could modulate the amplitude of the output signal with this dial here and dial in some LFO like this. We happen to be playing a triangle wave there on the modulator. But we can also use the loopable envelopes. Let's have a go at that. I'm going to turn down the sustain. Now when we loop the envelope with this little switch here, what we're actually doing is looping the attack and the decay portions. So depending on what you set in terms of the the controls, you could create a sawtooth, you could create an inverse sawtooth, you could create a triangle wave, or kind of anywhere in between. So let's have a little go at that. So there we go, we've got a little sawtooth going on there. Let's see how fast it goes. That's pretty impressive actually. Now, obviously, back in 1982, there was no MIDI implementation inside a Polivox, so there was no MIDI clock synchronization as something to worry about or implement. If you wanted to get your loopable envelopes to sort of like keep track with time of your music, then you had to do it by ear. It was very, very fiddly. You're going to have to either play around with the attack portion or the decay portion to get it exactly as you want. So it was very, very fiddly back then, old school, you can say. But that's what you used to do. Let's add a little bit of attack. So we're creating a triangle wave. We've got no control over the depth of this modulation with the amplifier section. There's no EG depth control like we have with the filter. So it's maximum modulation basically. But let's do a little bit of a slow modulation. And let's combine it with the LFO. Add a bit of a release and do something a bit like this. All sorts of effects you can get by looping these envelopes. Obviously you've got the filter envelope as well that you could be looping and try and get a, an interesting sort of like offset in terms of time between the amplifier section looping away and the filter section looping away, and then you can add the LFO. All sorts of interesting rhythmic effects you can get out of the Atomica by doing this. But while we're on the subject of talking about these modulations, let's just talk about the LFO itself, the one single LFO that we have here over on the left-hand side. The modulation capabilities of the original Polivox, they are pretty limited, but the fact that you add looping to those envelopes really does open it up and give you a lot more opportunities. The LFO, let's do like we did before with the magic of technology. Let's take away the controls that Cherry Audio have added and talk about what's left, which is what it was in the original Polivox. As you can see, what we're left with are just the two controls at the top. We've got the frequency or the speed of the LFO, and we've got its waveform, and that is basically it. That's what we have in terms of an LFO. Very, very simple. I will talk about everything that Cherry Audio have added here in Atomica in the next section. Okay, so now is the time to talk about all of the things that Cherry Audio have added to Atomica that were not there in the original Polivox. I'm going to gloss over them now, show you them on the front panel, and then with some of those controls we'll get into a little bit of a demo and listen to what they sound like. But let's start top left-hand corner, the modulator section. On the original Polivox, there was no sawtooth waveform on the LFO and no inverse sawtooth either. I don't know why they didn't provide a sawtooth, but it was not there. So Cherry Audio have added those two additional waveforms, and that's great. Those three switches below the dials in the modulator section, they are new. They were not there in the original Polivox either. Remember, this is 1982. There was no MIDI, so there was no requirement or possibility even to synchronize to MIDI clock. So that first switch, that's Cherry Audio adding that capability, and it's really, really useful to have. Now, if you look at any photographs of a Polivox, you may or may not notice at first glance, but there is no mod wheel and there's no pitch bend wheel either. So Cherry Audio have added the ability for us to be able to control the amount of modulation of the LFO using a mod wheel. Obviously the mod wheel of your choice on your MIDI controller keyboard. So that's there, that's the second switch. The third switch is a really cool feature, and it's allowing us to reset the phase of the LFO with each time we press a key. It's a very, very useful, very, very cool feature that Cherry Audio have added. Now let's move over to the filter section and the amplifier section. I'm just going to cover the controls that are new, that have been added to both those sections. So as I've just said, no MIDI implementation, and the keyboard on the original Polyvox was a really basic clacky thing, really quite horrible to play, I have to say. No velocity sensitivity at all. Cherry Audio have added velocity sensitivity to both the filter envelope and to the amplifier envelope. There are two more controls that are common to both the filter section and the amplifier section that Cherry Audio have added, and those are drive controls. We have a filter drive and an amplifier drive. Now, there is this whole characteristic of the sound of a Polyvox, which is a driven, overdriven, saturated kind of sound. Now, the Polyvox was made from quite poor quality components, and the sound characteristics from one Polyvox to the next can be quite varied. So rather than kind of pick a typical sound and bake it into Atomica, what Cherry Audio have decided to do is give us complete control over that amount of drive. And I think it's a really, really cool idea of them to do this. So we've got control over the amount of drive going into the filter, and we've got control over the amount of drive going into the amplifier. So you can really control the characteristics of Atomica from really aggressive to really, really passive. I'll give you some demonstrations of that in a second. Let's talk about the filter section in isolation now. We have got, as I mentioned before, in terms of the response, as well as low pass and band pass, Cherry Audio have added high pass, notch and peak. I don't know why certainly high pass wasn't added in there, but everywhere where you have a bandpass filter in a synthesizer, you generally have high pass as well, and sometimes they give us notch. Here, Cherry Audio have given us high pass and notch and peak as well, which is a very sort of like narrow banded kind of bandpass effect. I'll demonstrate that in a second as well for you. Next, keyboard tracking. There was no control on a Polyvox for you to adjust the keyboard tracking of the filter. It was hardwired somehow inside. Here, Cherry Audio have given us a control for full control of the keyboard tracking of the filter cutoff. One final control in the filter section that Cherry Audio have added. It's called Starve, and I actually don't quite know what this does. The only way to really describe it to you is to just demonstrate it to you. But I think what they did was they looked at the original circuitry of the Polyvox, and they looked at what would be possible to have a parameter to control, and this Starve control could have been there on the original Polyvox. It just wasn't. So they've added it. It makes some really interesting effects. I'll demonstrate that next too. I think I've covered pretty much everything that's been added. Bottom left hand corner, voice assign. Well, as I mentioned at the very beginning, Polyvox is a monosynth. It does have the ability to play two notes together, so duophonically. Now, like Cherry Audio do with all of the monosynths that they end up modeling, they've decided to give us polyphony. They've given us up to 16 voices of polyphony, and they've given us the ability to stack voices in a monophonic way and give us 16 voices, up to 16 voices of unison as well. Now, if you're a purist and you just want to play Atomica like you would play a Polyvox, then you just have to ignore that extra sort of capability, those extra voices, and just play it as a monosynth. But they are there for us, and you can create some really wonderful and interesting pads and polykey sounds out of Atomica. There's loads and loads and loads of amazing presets that come with Atomica for you to play around with and get inspired by. Here's a quick demo of Filter Drive. I'm using the bandpass filter for this particular demo. I've got quite a lot of LFO modulation going on with the cutoff of the filter as well as the filter envelope. Sounds like this. Now let's try this drive control. As opposed to none. dramatic difference, isn't it? Okay, little demo of the staff control. I've got a lot of resonance here, cut-off turn right down, and I'm going to modulate the cut-off with a long decay. I'm just going to play one note. Sounds like this. Sounds very nice. Let's turn up the starve, not to maximum, but kind of around there, and give that a go. We've created a liquid filter. So if you thought that was it, if you thought that was all that Cherry Audio were going to give us in Atomica, you'd be sorely wrong. As well as all of those additions that I've just gone through that they've added to Atomica that were not there in the original Polyvox, there were no effects in the original Polyvox, and there was no arpeggiator in the original Polyvox. Here, top right of Atomica, there are these two little buttons. At the moment we're looking at the main view, which is the main synth components, but we can flick to this view and magically we get a whole load more controls on that panel. Let me just flick between them so you can actually see that I did actually change something. The way that they've implemented these controls, I think it's just so clever. It's so wonderful. I really do love it. It's so in keeping with the original design of Atomica from its main front panel. We've got, well, let's talk about it. We've got an arpeggiator bottom left. It's got all the things in it that a regular arpeggiator should have. It's got some direction buttons, up, down, up and down, or random. It's got the number of octaves, the octave range that it's going to span across from 1 to 4 octaves. It's got a speed control, and you can sync it to MIDI clock as well. So it's got everything you'd expect an arpeggiator to have. The rest of the front panel is taken up by 4 sets of effects. This is a multi-effects engine that we've got here. First of all, we've got a very comprehensive phaser. We've got 4, 8 and 12 stages to it, selectable. We've got next to it a choice of flanger or chorus. Next to that, we've got 3 different emulations of different echoes or delays. We've got digital delay, tape delay, and ping pong delay. And then to the right of that, we've got 5 different reverb emulations: spring, plate, room and hall, and a galactic reverb as well. And what I love about these multi-effects is that we have got here, just like we have on the main panel with the main sort of synth architecture components, we've got a modulator control, FX modulator here, here, here and here, and they're modulating different aspects of the effects. And what is modulating them is a completely new modulator, a completely new LFO that you've got up here. It looks very, very similar. In fact, it's identical to the regular modulator, but we've got it here for modulating our effects. I just really think that it's so classy the way they've implemented the multi-effects and the arpeggiator in the second panel on Atomica. I just keep flicking between it and just loving it. So, if it's okay with you, I just want to give you a few final thoughts, really not with my Cherry Audio hat on, but with my Tim Shoebridge hat on, if I can do that. I hope you don't mind. I'm playing you out a little bit of ambient music, and the reason why I wrote that little bit of music is to kind of show you the other side of Atomica and the other side of my Polyvox. You know, it doesn't have to be all about angry, brutal, distorted sounds. You can create some really gentle, calm, serene, ambient sounds as well. You know, as much as I love my Polyvox that I've got behind me here, you know, there's always that dread in the back of my mind that one day I'll walk through the door, switch it on, and it won't switch on anymore. I mean, that's the brutal truth of vintage instruments. But here we have Cherry Audio. They've condensed and bottled up all of that wonderful sonic goodness and that wonderful sonic character of that old instrument, and it's available to us in such a convenient format, with all the sort of like the modern conveniences of being a virtual instrument, running up multiple instances, of being able to stack voices. You've got polyphony in there, you've got all the MIDI control, all the automatable control that you would want, the multi-effects, the control over the drive and the grit. It's just all amazing. Now, I wouldn't say that it sounds exactly the same as my Polyvox in all instances. My Polyvox is desperately in need of recalibration and in servicing as well. But what I can say is that every patch that I've made on my Polyvox I've been able to recreate in Atomica, and I think that speaks volumes for the accuracy of the sound that they've been able to create in Cherry Audio's Atomica. That's all I want to say on that. That's with my Tim Shoebridge hat on. I really enjoyed playing with Atomica. It's a really fantastic addition to the Cherry Audio library. Thank you very much. Until the next video, thanks as always.